Alright, how about these here Crusades? So, after a little bit of time underway, I managed to play. I'm gonna make sure I'm not getting a package right now. I managed to play both the first and third Crusade. That's the two scenarios that are available in this sucker. And well, I screwed up the rules on the first Crusade significantly. In fact, the rules on the first Crusade are very problematic. But I missed something in it that actually improved the game. It's been happening a few times recently. The reinforcement chart normally generates so many Muslim reinforcements that I've found, at least in my solo plays, and I generally am pretty good about getting a feel for balance in multiplayer games solo. Whatever prior games I played where I did the reinforcements correctly, the Crusaders get nowhere. The simple fact is, one side can't. You have a bunch of players, 3 or 4 Muslim players and 4 Christian players in sort of the full game of it. 7 players is the full game, but 8 is the expanded, split the Muslims up even further. They can't attack their own people, right? Muslims cannot attack Muslims, Christians cannot attack Christians unless they both agree to, right? So what you end up having with that is a situation where even if the Christians work all together, they still cannot overcome the advantage that the Muslims get off this reinforcements chart. Now, it may or may not be historically reasonable. It feels like the Muslims are a little too weak the way I played it. It felt like the Christians had too easy a job getting through the Holy Land. They were able to split their forces, yet make it through Antioch with only half the army, make it down to Jerusalem, etc. So, in terms of a simulation, I'm not sure what it should be. Should it be hellishly difficult and the Crusaders require a miracle of some sort to get through it? Or should it be this nicely kind of balanced game that I feel like I actually got out of it, that was kind of interesting? I'm not sure. I have gripes either way, basically. On top of that, there are some real flaws in the rules with it. There's some real problems with how attrition goes because you have so much ability to split your forces. Once you kind of come to resolving the issues with the base rules, though, at least the third Crusade is pretty playable. So, for example, the attrition rules, if you look at my introduction for this, I go into these kind of heavily and go off on them because they are really, really problematic. I don't think you can play this game as written or anything close to it. I think it requires significant modification. The first Crusade's problem is that as you keep going, that you still feel like you have to make fixes throughout the game. You feel like the first Crusade isn't just a matter of maybe somebody forgot a couple of things, and this is a Berg game, and from an era in SPI when there were definitely starting to tweak the core of, here's a simple SPI game, this is what these things are about, So you go back 2 years from this, and there were no problems in most of the games, because they were all the same. Almost all. But you start hitting this era, and this is the beginning of their real innovation, their second period of innovation. Their first period of innovation was, let's make a new combat results chart, and let's worry about OOBs a little bit more than Avalon Hill does, and let's get some of that historical aspect down better. And there are some good games from that era. Some neat things like Winter War that kind of surprise you. You've got some little tricks built into them. But something like this is really kind of going off the rails from what SPI used to be prior to it. And this is really sort of that opening period when SPI kind of blossoms into something and then gets cut off at the end. And then that migrates over to Victory Games, and you can see, sort of where that was going under Mark Herman's guidance. Anyway, this, like Armada, has some issues. This one has more serious issues than Armada does, but it doesn't get the kind of flack that Armada gets for it. Armada gets flack because I guess they came out with, a page of errata for it, kind of like they did with Fall of Rome. This one they never really came out with much in the way of errata, but it's not playable even with the errata. You have to go further, and there's some unofficial errata that work very well, but you may or may not want to use them. I have some disagreements with them and don't really want to use them for everything. Anyway, First Crusade is sort of this wild and multiplayer diplomatic war game. And it's very, very appealing for that. Yet, my solo games of it have never met what my expectations were for it. Part because the game's broken, part maybe because I'll forget a rule like this, or maybe worse, I'll play with the rule correctly and it'll screw the game completely. The Third Crusade, on the other hand, feels pretty balanced. It feels like an interesting game. There's this neat little cat and mouse. But what's wrong with it there is the cat and mouse becomes dependent upon the hidden orders and stuff. You saw what kind of happened at the end there. However you decide to interpret the written orders movement and how it's supposed to work can gravely affect the game. And then within that, and there's no clear way to interpret it. I mean, there's no obvious, this is how it should be done. Like with the attrition, you're kind of saying, I can't think of a good answer for this. Let's go with something and try it. So in the game that I played, it definitely showed a couple of really interesting situations in it. But they're interesting situations of rock, paper, scissors in some way, where you're kind of looking at it and saying, okay, well, if he goes here, I want to be here, but if he goes in this direction, I want to go here. And sometimes, like at the very end of my game, you could set it up so that you've got your opponent completely defeated. You dominate him completely. There are no moves he can make that are good anymore. But that can't happen until somebody gets the lead in the game, basically. That was a situation where the Crusaders would either have to give up Jerusalem or, it turned out, give up everything. And I chose wrong. I should have given up Jerusalem and gone up to the north and tried to, fight something out along the Tyre Acre border or something. But a lot of that becomes kind of like looking at a diplomacy map and trying to figure out your puzzle. How can I beat the person? Where can I move to beat them? Okay, what about the actual systems within the game? Let's look at them more carefully. Because I kind of want to look at the sequence of play to give me that. Okay, so the diplomacy is very free-form over in the First Crusade. Then you have this orders writing segment, which isn't that heavy a burden. In the two-player game, I've got each player's orders on one little thing. This is about what you'd be writing for orders in the First Crusade per player as well. So, as you can see, it's kind of like playing diplomacy in terms of the amount of effort that you've got to put into your written orders. If you do them sloppy the way I do. But what you're supposed to do is actually trace the route hex by hex. There are reasons for that, because if you go through a hex that's on defense status, you have to stop. So I kind of cut some shortcuts there. There should be a hex by hex movement indicated in some way. Usually I know it in my head, so it's no big deal. But if you're playing it opposed, you may have to be more careful. The random events. Hey, what's a bird game without random events, right? That's the common saying about them. The ones in the Third Crusade are pretty clear again. The First Crusade is filled with ones, some of which require interpretation in the moment if you haven't bothered to make that decision beforehand by looking at them all and figuring out what's going to go on with them. They can also shake things up significantly. Again, more so in the First Crusade than the Third Crusade. The Third Crusade's more of a clear, I'm going to try to outsmart you with my movement plots type of game. Then the First Crusade has this money and bribery, and that all goes away with the Third Crusade. So in the First Crusade, you never really take attrition. You're just constantly, paying money, and if you have no money, you stop and try to collect some in taxes. That goes away in the Third Crusade, and you start suffering from attrition, and you also don't have random reinforcements for the Muslims. You don't have anything to kind of keep you going. What you have at the beginning of the game is what you have for the whole game. So there's a different flavor to it in both cases as to what you can get out of the play. Are there any hopes after you fail in the First Crusade? Yeah, as the Muslims there are, because you can keep getting reinforcements. Even if you ignore this table, there's still this possibility of getting 5 extra strength points, which could be a big deal at times. There's no such hope in the Third Crusade, but there are still some things. The Philip Goes Home event, if that doesn't happen for a long time, the Crusaders can get rid of the troops off the guys who are going to leave and get them killed and whatnot before they leave. Use them all. Movement, I've already kind of discussed that. That's got 2 huge problems with it. One is interpreting the movement plots. And that has to, you really do have to kind of hash that out with your opponents, or have someone just explain how it's going to be after they've hashed it out to themselves. Or, and the attrition rules require some hashing out as well. Or else you're going to have the ability that the Crusaders can split their forces up however they like, and therefore send out 1 strength point stacks all along the same path and not suffer any attrition just because they have lots and lots of leaders. Neither one of them is very appealing. And anything you try to do to make this attrition system work doesn't quite do it. Combat's kind of neat. But a little just random. You roll to see what tactic you're going to use. It'd be kind of cool if it had a chit pick type thing, but tactics are just either good or bad. You roll to see if your leader does a good job. That's basically all you do. And then that gives you column shifts when you come over to the table. It'd be kind of neat if this had a tactical matrix, kind of like 1776 and games after that. Although I would hate that in play, it would be interesting. You could actually reflect the strengths and weaknesses in a way that wasn't just a deterministic off a non-deterministic off a die roll. The leader casualties is this weird little thing where, again, for the Crusader, for the Muslims, it sucks to lose a leader. It especially sucks to lose your big leader, but the chance of that is fairly low. But for the Crusaders, they end up having to roll for basically every leader until they've lost 2. And then they lose troops along with the leader, kind of at random. Weird effects to this. Mechanically, it's a pain in the ass. And also mechanically a pain in the ass is keeping track of the Crusader strength points on these little strength charts. That's just an annoyance because you have to continually be counting up. You have to look at which counters you have. You have to keep a running total or something to help you keep track of how many strength points you have. And that, of course, can get out of date if you're doing it. On the other side of combat is the siege, which works okay. It actually, I kind of like how it works with the attrition table giving an advantage to the attacker and eventually getting it down to the point where you can make an assault. That catches a feeling that other games that try to do it with like breach levels or stuff like that, they just don't seem to work right. This really does seem to capture the siege element nicely for the period, and I haven't seen many games that do that. And then, of course, the economics phase, which also has some little ambiguities in the rules. That's only a First Crusade rule, but when and where you can collect taxes, when and where you can spend money, all of this requires, I think, some degree of interpretation of the rules. That, the whole thing almost takes a rewrite, which is one of the problems. On the other hand, this was such an exciting subject, and it was such a neat treatment at the time. Now, for me, I didn't know it was a neat treatment. These were my first war games. This, Stonewall, Tannenberg, these sort of mid to late era SPI games were the first ones I saw, and I didn't realize how much these games were, Armada as well, were making a change in the world of wargaming, as it were. But this really was at the cusp of that. Overall, I don't know if anyone's really hashed out a fun game of the First Crusade yet out of this. I've got hopes that for that at least, for the multiplayer First Crusade, Onward Christian Soldier, which is Berg's revisiting of the subject matter and doing it with kind of a point-to-point system, I think. Still kind of weird, but I'm hoping that does a better job. This one hasn't managed to do it for me, at least as a solo game. And Opposed, I just could never get anybody to play it. I couldn't get sufficient numbers to play it. I got people to play Imperium Romanum and some other things, but maybe they got burned enough that by the time I pulled this one out and said, well, the rules are a little iffy on this one, everybody kind of shied away from me when I suggested that. Among other things, we had a couple non-war gamers in our group who really weren't terribly thrilled with, say, Imperium Romanum, and definitely didn't want to touch something that, although it may be more interesting and freewheeling, might have some serious issues with the rules. Something like PAX was fine. Something like this is just a little too far for that. And when we did manage to get big groups of people for what I would call sort of a pure war game, it was always WIF or Empires in Arms or one of these really huge things where we'd get people who were all very into it. It was very hard to get a group who was willing to try lots of new war games, or especially multiplayer war games. They were basically sold on one or two games and really interested in those, and that's all they wanted to touch on. So that was kind of a funny situation there, that I had a lot of trouble getting something like this played. The two-player game I've played a number of times. I've had fun with it. I had fun with it solo. I think it's a solid game, and if you're willing to put a little bit of effort in, probably worth the investment. This still is, this does not go for much. I've seen copies of it either on Geek or on eBay for, I don't know, under $20, in much better condition than my poor set. But yeah, overall, the biggest thing for me was that First Crusade, and it has been a disappointment throughout my life, largely because the rules just, they really need to be completely rewritten. The things that worked kind of fix things in the Third Crusade. Because of the limited area that you're moving in, because you've got one opponent, they don't end up being as big an issue. Somehow, even simple things like the movement and attrition tables, this all becomes really, really more annoying when you try to apply the fixes to the rules for the Third Crusade. Of course, even the Third Crusade has its problems beyond that, like putting the True Cross in Jerusalem and it has no effect on play. Yeah, it's there, but why? Alright, anyway, it's kind of nice to revisit something like this, but I'm really hoping So, two things. One, that Onward Christian Soldiers makes the multiplayer version of this obsolete. It adds more Crusades as well. And here's another one. This isn't a hope. This is a knowledge. That third Crusade, I would rather play Kingdom of Heaven than this. I don't feel like the card play aspect to Kingdom of Heaven is... So CDGs come with sort of this gaminess to them. I don't feel that card play element is more gamey than the movement plot for this. And the rules for Kingdom of Heaven are tight. You'll have no problem. If you want to sit down and play something based on the subject of the Crusades, and you've got, I don't remember how many scenarios, 9, 11, something like that. Maybe just 7, I don't know. You got a bunch of scenarios in there, all on the Crusades, all with their own little flavor and everything. But they're all 2-player. So the hope here is that Onward Christian Soldiers works well enough to give me a multiplayer experience that's fun. More fun than this. Definitely says something that I walked away from this twice, you know. I mean, on video I very seldomly don't play something out to the bitter end. In this case, the first Crusade one, I feel like there was still some opportunity for some stuff happening, but I just couldn't face it. It gets tiresome in a way. And you may see that when I start playing the Imperium Romanum scenarios too, where I'm just like, alright, I can predict what's going to happen. I just don't feel like playing this out anymore. Alright, up it goes.